from next year. He said, the Prime Minister, the BBC received a settlement which was conditional upon their paying for TV licences for the over 75s. They should cough up. Meanwhile, the BBC said it was the government who decided to stop funding free TV licences for over 75s, and Parliament gave responsibility to the BBC to make a decision on the future of the scheme. There was no guarantee the BBC would continue to fund free licences for the over 75s, as the Culture Secretary at the time has confirmed. We've reached the fairest decision that we can reach in funding free TV licences for the poorest pensioners while protecting BBC services. If the BBC funded all TV licences for the over 75s, it would mean the closure of BBC Two, BBC Four, BBC News, BBC Scotland, Radio 5 Live, and several local radio stations, says the BBC. Are they telling the truth about that? That it would cost so much that they would have to shut all those different channels? You might not worry about some of them, but all those different channels in order to fund the TV licence for the over 75s. How fair is it that the responsibility is on the BBC, and should they be able to bring it back by making a few cost savings, I don't know, on talent salaries, for example? Roger Mosey is a former BBC editorial director, Master of Selwyn College, Cambridge. Mark Whitfield is a spokesperson for the TV licence resistance. Thank you to you both. Let me start with you first, Mr. Mosey. The war of words between Boris Johnson and the BBC, who's going to win, ultimately, do you think?
Well, for the BBC, I think this is a nightmare that never ends. I mean, it all goes back, as you say, Tom, to 2015, and George Osborne, as Chancellor, has this nifty idea that the government will stop paying for free TV licences and the BBC should take over the responsibility. And I think the problem there was the BBC should never have agreed to that deal. It was a terrible deal at the time, but actually in public they said it was very good because they had an increase in the inflation rate, they had closing loopholes on the iPlayer. So that deal in 2015 was really fateful for both the government and the BBC. And I think where Boris Johnson is right is that there was an expectation that the BBC would take responsibility and would look after the licence fee. However, where the BBC is right is it was always clear that they could, if they wanted to, scrap the concession. And of course now, in the financial situation they're in 2019, they've decided they are going to partially scrap the concession.
When you say the financial situation they're in, you don't need to go very far to pick up a newspaper and see that stars' salaries have increased, that there are huge numbers of services, that there's money. I think there's about 100 million quid being spent on a marketing campaign for something called BBC Sounds. It's not a great way of spending money, is it?
Well, the BBC says that the cost of the old age pensioner licence concession is £750 million. And I think even if you scrapped all the top talent and all the highly paid management, you'd probably only get to 40, 50 million of that. So the BBC has a case that if you really want to make the big expensive dramas and the popular programmes on BBC One and BBC Two and the rest of it, you do need a properly funded BBC. And as someone who worked for the BBC, I really do support that. I think where the BBC got its messages very confused was it said in 2015 that this settlement, including the licence fee obligations for pensioners, left it slightly better off. Now they're saying if you do have to lose if the BBC has to pay for the concession, it would shut down pretty much every channel you can think of. So I think somewhere between that, there is a position in which the BBC would come up with a more realistic funding options, and they haven't really been terribly open with us about that.
I wonder whether, Roger, finally, you detect a shift in public attitude towards the BBC. It has been much loved, much treasured, does great things, and yet it might seem, and I suspect we're going to hear from people who hold this view, that perhaps larger sections of the public are falling out of love a bit with Auntie.
Well, I think that is the BBC's big problem, because pensioners are now clearly irritated and annoyed by what's happened here. And I think what I say about the nightmare never ends is that clearly some people next year won't pay the licence fee. The BBC will have to decide whether to prosecute. The very worst case is, we send a 90-year-old to prison because they haven't paid their licence fee. And as you say, the worry at the other end of the scale is that younger audiences are not really coming to the BBC very much at all now. Certainly the amount of consumption is dropping. So there's not much affection or loyalty in the younger audiences, and the older audiences have now been alienated by this. And it is a position which I do think is incredibly difficult for the BBC. And you're right that if they don't navigate this skillfully, consent for the whole licence fee is going to
Roger, grateful as always. Roger Mosey, former BBC editorial director and master of Selwyn College, Cambridge. 9:10. Mark Whitfield is a spokesman for TV licence resistance. Morning to you, Mark.
Morning, Tom.
Do you think it should be the BBC that funds the licence fee for over 75s?
I think they have to accept that that's what they agreed. They 5 years ago they went into negotiations with the government. They had a number of demands that were beneficial to them, and they accepted responsibility for the over 75 licence as part of that deal. I think Boris Johnson is correct in holding them to account for that agreement. If they made a mistake, then let them own up to that and try and sort out the issue as it now stands.
Why would you give somebody who can afford it, based on age, access to a free benefit?
Well, I think we do that as a society, to
based on
thank
age
pensioners for their contribution over their lives, don't we?
Yes, and people have a large and healthy debate about that, whether or not all children should have access to free school meals, for example. Why are people paying tax dollars so that David Beckham's child can have a free school meal, for example, goes the argument.
Yes.
In the same way, why would we want to lose apparently valuable services like BBC Two and others in order that Sir Alan Sugar can get something that he could otherwise pay for free?
Yeah, we can leave it to the discretion of individual pensioners as to whether they wish to claim their free licences, and that's always been the case.
That's
this is
nonsense,
something
isn't it? You have people who can afford it, who would give that 150 quid to charity, do something else with it. They don't need this free benefit, really.
Well, I think a lot of the pensioners say that they do, and I think you enter into this kind of war of victimhood between the pensioners who say that they can't afford to pay the fee and the BBC that makes these outrageous comments about how much of its services it will have to close if it can't resolve this issue of its own making. And that's the frustration here from our point of view, that the BBC yet again is trying to rewrite history for its own benefit and in its own mind. And in this case, I think it's picked on the wrong group of people to disadvantage through that process.
Do you think the BBC is ultimately
are a very plausible victim group in this?
Do you think the BBC is ultimately bluffing when it says we've got to close half the thing?
I think it's ridiculous. The BBC's accounts are incredibly opaque as it stands. The fact is that they've claimed poverty over successive years and with successive governments, when in fact the licence fee revenue goes from strength to strength, and it regularly achieves new record levels of income. And to claim poverty against that backdrop, it just doesn't make sense. It's completely unrealistic.
And I'm afraid, with the backdrop of millions of pounds being spent on marketing campaigns to try and reach younger audiences, and salaries for various people going up enormously, senior management getting huge pay rises, that's you see how that can fit a narrative of trying to plead poverty when you're doling out the cash. Mark, thank you. Mark Whitfield, spokesperson for TV licence resistance.